Good morning. Today is Monday, the 16th day of Elul. Yesterday we didn't give the shir, and Shabbos of course not. So in the description there is a link to lessons from last year that covers the lesson of Shabbos, Saturday, the lesson of yesterday. And we started Shabbos, the Igeret Hakodesh, letter 15, which is not really a letter, but it's a very fundamental chapter that the Rebbe describes and explains in short, but he gives us an explanation to understanding of the 10 attributes. But let's begin also with giving the tzedakah. As we mentioned, tzedakah tatzil memavos, and especially in the month of Elul, we should add. It's always good to add a pushka in your house. Always give every day tzedakah, as the Rebbe encouraged. So, understanding the sfirot, understanding the attributes. There is in general, 10 sfirot, 3 intellectual attributes, and 7 emotive attributes. And in the beginning of the letter, the Alter Rebbe gave 2 introductions. Number 1, that we have to understand, it says, Mi besari echazeh elokah. We can see God from our flesh. That God created humankind in his image. And therefore, by understanding the attributes, the different character traits that we have, we can understand godliness. And that will lead us, will help us to connect to Hashem and to develop feelings of love and fear of Hashem through understanding our attributes. And introduction number 2, the Alter Rebbe said that we should not mistake and we should not think that really our attributes, for our chesed, for example, attributes of goodness, of giving, is the same as it is above. He says absolutely not. Even the attribute of Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, he said, he was the personification of the attribute of giving, always giving. And even when there was no one to give, like the story when he was, after his circumcision, God took out the sun, made it a very hot day, so there should be no people passing by. And that's what he always did every day. He would serve the people who passed by in the desert. But on that day, God wanted to make it easier for him. He made it a very hot day, so there were no people. So if there are no people, he can take a break, he can take a rest. But Avraham, it bothered him because he had the nature of giving. And the nature of giving, chesed, it's not about the recipient. It's more about the person, the giver. He wants to give. So if there was no one to give, it pained him. And that's why Hashem made a miracle and he sent the angels to come in forms of people, and then he served them. So, nevertheless, we know Avram was the epitome of chesed, but he said to Hashem, V'anochi yafa va'efer, I'm like dust and ashes. And Alter Rebbe explained, what does it mean by saying that he's ashes? He says the ashes is the essential material of, let's say, a piece of furniture. Piece of furniture could be a very expensive piece of furniture, has the characteristics, but if you burn it, there is the elements of fire, water, and air that goes away, and what remains is the element of the earth the dust, which is in the ashes. So he says, Avraham Avinu says, I am like ashes, meaning to say that I'm compared to the higher chesed, the higher kindness, I'm like ashes compared to this expensive piece of furniture. That's the way the Alter Rebbe explains it. So to understand this, the Alter Rebbe tells us that we should not think that when we describe the emotive characteristics, the attributes that we have, we shouldn't think that we can understand already God's attributes. It is just a mere comparison, but very, very far distant. Having said that, Alter Rebbe begins to explain the 10 attributes. He first begins with the 7 emotive attributes. And just to explain it in short, outside, and then we're going to see it inside. So if we go to psychologists, psychiatrists, they'll tell you about so many different types of emotions that a person has. But here the Alter Rebbe comes and says that they're all included in these 7 basic emotions. And everything what makes us work is based on these emotions. These emotions make us think, make us do what we do. And if you go even further, they're all included in the first 2 emotions, which is giving and not giving. And we'll explain. And then finally, he says even further it's included in the very first emotive, which is the emotion of giving. Because any type of emotions, when you develop emotions with something, it is when there is a giver, when there's a giver and receiver, when you give. So even the emotion of restrictive emotion, of not giving, is because it is restricting not to give to that person who you want to give, or you don't want to give. And here the Alter Rebbe explains these emotive attributes, and then he explains how it is also connected with the intellectual attributes. Let's see inside. Says the Alter Rebbe, as regard to the totality of the 10 spheres, as they appear in the soul of man, it is known to all that emotive attributes divide into 7 general categories. And each of the particular attributes in a man derives from one of these 7 attributes. Because they are the root of all the attributes in their generality. All the attributes, all kinds of emotive characteristics that is in humans, they all come from these 7. And it begins to explain. The first one, Shemidas HaChesed Lashpia Bli Gvul, namely, the attribute of Chesed, loving kindness, which is a thrust to diffuse benevolence to all without limits. Just to give. Is giving a good thing? Sometimes it's not. When we say, they say a young person who is not a liberal has no heart, and an older person who is not a conservative has no brain. That's a famous saying. What does it mean? I'm not trying to offend anyone, God forbid, but the point here is that sometimes there is a person that has the attribute of giving without limits. Without limits. No judging whether the person deserves it or doesn't deserve it. Whether it will help him or will harm him. giving. The chesed says, I see a person, I see something that I need to give, and I want to give. Restriction, judgment, is judging whether the person deserves it, whether it's going to help, whether not. That is the giver, the judgment. And then the Alter Rebbe is going to explain that there is the attribute of tiferet, rachamim, compassion. Compassion is a combination of both. It is about giving, it is about giving and judging whether the person deserves it or not, but giving nevertheless. And the giving of rachamim is not like the chesed with no limits, without calculations. It is calculated giving, but it is a calculated giving of seeing the potential of the person and realizing that deep, deep, deep inside there's something good, and it calls the rachamim, the compassion, which is rooted deeper than both chesed and gevurah. And that is why it gives even to those who don't deserve. So this is the first three attributes. He'll give some examples also soon in in terms of teaching a child, of a father teaching a child, and so on. Continues the Alter Rebbe. ומידס הגבורה לצמצם ולהשפיע כל כך, או שלא ישפיע כלל. The attributes of Gevurah stern limitations and contraction, which seeks to restrain such a degree of diffusion or to withhold diffusion altogether from certain individuals. That is the kind of chesed and Gevurah. Then you have Midas Rachamim. The third attribute is the attribute of Rachamim, the compassion, which is also called Tiferet. The attribute of Rachamim, Lerachem Mishashayich Lashonachman Asalav. The attribute of Rachamim, compassion, which seeks to pity a person to whom compassion is appropriate, and to extend benevolence to him as well, although he may be unworthy of it. Rachamim is the mediating attribute between Gevurah and Chesed, which is, Chesed is about just giving. שהיא להשפיע על הכל גם למי שלא שייך לו שנחמן עליו. שהיא להשפיע על הכל גם למי שלא ישייך לו שנחמן עליו. The latter of which would diffuse benevolence to all, even to a person to whom compassion is not at all appropriate. Inasmuch as he lacks nothing and he is in no state of trouble whatsoever. So it says, because the attribute of chesed is unlimited, it desires to benefit even someone who lacks nothing. That's why I have a little problem with the word, the latter. Probably it refers to the latter is over here, but when he says mention Gevurah and Chesed, so this is the latter. Although Chesed is the first attribute, but here he mentions, Alter Rebbe mentions Chesed second. That's why he refers to this as the latter. So basically, what he's saying that Chesed is about giving. Chesed is about giving to one that doesn't even need it. Because chesed is, again, it's about the giver, it's not about the recipient. But the Rachmanis is the middle. Now, because the attribute of Rachman is the mediating attribute, it is called Tiferes. Tiferes means beauty. And the Alter Rebbe says that beauty, what is beauty? Like a beautiful garment. What makes a garment beautiful? You can have nice garments, and then you have a beautiful garment. The beauty is when you have colors that combine and become harmonized together and create a new beauty. by analogy with beauty, with beautiful garments, which are dyed with many colors, blended, in a way that gives rise to beauty and decoration. So a white dress can be beautiful, can be nice. A black dress can be nice, can be beautiful. But when you have a combination of two colors, there is something that comes from a higher than both colors. It brings out something that each of these colors don't have on its own. The combination, the harmony of the colors, whatever colors it is. To a garment dyed in one color, however, one cannot apply the term tiferet, which implies the beauty of harmony. And since the attributes of Rachamim is compounded of Chesed and Gevurah, the term tiferet is appropriate. That's why this compassion is a kind of harmony, a kind of combination of Chesed and Gevurah, but it comes from a deeper place. That is why it enables to give even to those who don't deserve. So now, this is the first three attributes, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet. Then says the Alter Rebbe, once you already have the emotion to give or not to give, then it goes to the next stage. The next stage is Netzach Hod Yesod. And that is the three attributes which we'll explain Yesod soon, but first is the Netzach and the Hod, is the attributes that make the next step of determination after you want to give, whether to actually give and how to give. And we'll explain that. It says, afterwards, once the attributes of either Chesed, of Gevurah, or Tiferes is aroused to dispense benevolence, as the diffusion is realized, that is, at the time of actual diffusion, now it is necessary to deliberate how to diffuse in such a way that the recipient will be able to absorb the diffusion. So it's going to give an example of a father who wants to teach something to his son. So there is the debate within yourself, whether to give it to the son, whether the son is capable of receiving that deep concept you want to give him. You want the son to be smart, you want the son to learn something, but you're debating whether it is or not, whether the son is capable of receiving it. Once you decided that yes, then you need to take the second step and to determine how to give. You're going to give everything you think, the son is going to get nothing, only going to get confused. You have to break it down. You have to judge within yourself how to deliver the thought. So he says, for example, when one wishes, and this is a powerful desire to convey and teach an intellectual subject to his son. Now, if he tells it to him in its totality, just as it appears in his own mind, the son will be able to understand. The son will be unable to understand and to absorb it. So what does he have to do? Rather, one needs to arrange it for him in a different order and context, such as providing an example from an alternative context. For example, we're learning about Chesed and Gevurah. sometimes bring the comparison of fire and water. So you can come and teach the child about fire and teach him about water. And he'll come home and he says, Mommy, you know what Daddy told me today? Fire goes up and water goes down. It's interesting. And then eventually you're going to lead him to understand that this is the idea of chesed, this is gevura, and so on. Me'at. You have to give him dover alefanav, every word fitly spoken. Me'at, little by little. Now this process, as the Alter Rebbe, is the attributes of Netzach and Hod. This deliberation regarding how best to present the concept is referred to by the term of Netzach and Hod. These attributes are the kidneys that advise in a manner similar to the physical counterpart. They are also, in spiritual terms, the two testicles that prepare the spermatozoa. This is the semen that comes from being a very subtle, almost spiritual thing that comes from the brain, goes through the spine all the way until the semen comes out. It becomes materialized through, and what it explains here, through the two testicles. This says, but the Rebbe brings those examples because that's the way it works. The system, the biology, the way God created us. He created us in that term, in that image, and it is true in every area, in the area of the physical biology, in the area of our emotions, the way it develops, it's all the same. This is the drop that issues from the brain. That is, going back to the analogy, to the example of the intellect that the father wants to give to the child. So he says, that is, they adapt an intellectual subject deriving from the father's mind in such a way that it will not issue unmodified, meaning as a very subtle concept in his brain and intellect. He's not going to deliver the thought the way it's in the father's intellect. But that it changes somewhat from the subtlety of the intelligence and becomes somewhat less subtle concept. So that the son will be able to absorb it in his mind and understand it. This is truly analogous to the seminal drop which descends from the brain. It is extremely tenuous. And through the kidneys and through testicles, it becomes truly concrete and corporal. That's one aspect of the Netzach and the Hod. Then the Alter Rebbe says it is not only to change, but also to break it down. There's the idea of changing from something more subtle to something more tangible. And there is also the process of breaking down to small pieces. You cannot give him everything at once. That's what he says. Netzach and Hod also are referred to as grinders and milestones because they grind the manna for the righteous. Like the heaven, which is named Shchakim. Shchakim means grinding, because the manna, they grind the manna for the righteous. What does it mean? You know, the manna was a spiritual food that the Jews ate in the desert. There is manna that the angels receive, but the manna comes from a very from a very spiritual, lofty place. And in order to be able to contain that spirituality, it needs to be broken down. And that is what it's called in the spiritual sense, that heaven that is called Shchakim, which is a sort of a grinder that grinds down this spiritual energy that comes down. For example, it says, just as by way of example, a person who grinds wheat with milestones and crumbles it into very fine parts. So too does the father need to taper the insights for the intellectual subject he wishes to convey to his sons. And to divide them into many parts, relating them to him gradually with advice and discernment. Because that's a real teacher. A real teacher is to come and to realize how the student is able to receive and to give him the right thing. Not just giving whatever. Like the story with the guy, he wanted to smuggle through the border coffee. Coffee was a very expensive thing, and you're not allowed to smuggle coffee. So he smuggled coffee. He puts and fills on his suitcase with coffee. And when it comes to the border, the customs, they ask him, "What do you have in the suitcase?" He says, "I have bird food." And he says, "Okay, open up." And they open up and find coffee. And he says, "That's bird food?" He says, "Yes, I'm going to give it to the birds. If they want to eat it, they'll eat it. If not, they're not going to eat it." So when you give, sometimes when you teach something, you just teach, just give people something, and they're not capable of eating it, then it's not giving. It's not food for them. This is what the Netzach and Hod does, to break it down, to make sure that whatever you give is something that the recipient is able to receive. Then the Alter Rebbe says there's another element of Netzach. Netzach also in Hebrew means nitzachon, victorious, being determined. And that is when you want to give, when Chesed tells you to give, or Rachamim tells you to give. You made a decision to give. And then when it comes to actual giving, the Gevurah is going to wake up again. And there's going to be some fighting that you need to fight with yourself to actually do it. Like you decided to give a donation, and when it actually comes to put your hand in your pocket and give, still you need another push. You need to fight yourself. That is the Netzach. וגם בכלל בחינס נצח הוא לנצח ולעמוד נגד כל מיני השפוע והלימוד מבנוי מבית ובחוץ. The category of Netzach also comprises prevailing and standing up against anything from within or from without that withholds from his son the transmission of beneficial influence or learning. From within means firmly resisting the attribute of Gevura and Tzimtzum within the Father himself. For it arouses within his will contentions against his son. Arguing that his son is not yet fit for this profound knowledge. Okay? So this is the Netzach. And finally, the Alter Rebbe explains what is Yesod. Yesod is once you're already determined to give. Yesod is the actual connection. Connection and giving. Determination. Are you connecting and giving by connecting? That is why Yesod is the union between husband and wife. Yesod is the love that you give with love. The Frierdiker Rebbe says why he brings the example of a father and a son and not a teacher and a student. He says, because the way a father would teach a son is much more beneficial than a teacher and student in that sense. Because a teacher and a student, sometimes it could be the teacher just delivers the intellectual deliverance. The father he loves his son, and he wants to give him. When you do something with love, with connection, with passion, two things happen. Number one, the son opens up and he feels it and he receives it. Number two, or maybe the other one is number one, is that the father himself is capable of bringing out much, much better when you want to teach something. It creates within you a deeper, a better ability of giving. And that is the level of Yesod. The category of Yesod is, by way of example, the bond by which the father binds his intellect with the intellect of his son. We're teaching him with love and willingness, for he wishes his son to understand. And without this bond, the Rebbe says, if without this bond, the son wouldn't be able to understand that way properly. Without this bond, even if the son would hear the very same words from the mouth of his father as he speaks and studies to himself, let's say the father sits and studies to himself the same words, and the son listens there. But if you're not talking to your son, he's not going to be able to understand it. If the same words you repeat when you're talking to him, is able then to understand it. He will not understand them as well as now. Now, when the father binds his intellect to him and speaks with him face to face with love and desire, because he desires very much that his son understands, then he will understand much better. And the greater the desire and delight of the father, the greater is the influence and the learning. Because then the son is able to absorb more, and the father communicates more proportionately. The father is able to communicate much deeper thoughts when he has the desire to. And why is that? It says that the Rebbe ki al yedei achishek v'atainug misrabe u'mizgadel sichloi ve'archovas adas lashpia u'lelamed benoi. For through the desire and the delight, the desire to teach has such a power, has a power on the intellect. It enhances the intellect. Through the desire and delight, and with a contented disposition of his own insight, is heightened and amplified so that he can bestow enlightenment upon his son and teach him. In Alter Rebbe sense, once again, this is similar to the physical condition in biology. When people have more desire, it creates more physical semen. This parallel draws a metaphor from the attribute of Yesod in the sphere of the truly physical, the profusion of the semen that results from the heightened desire and delight, and through which much is elicited from the brain, which is the source. This is why the Kabbalists seek to illustrate the imparting of knowledge out of a sense of pleasure, that they use the analogy of physical union, as will be explained. This is the end of today's shir. Gives us a beautiful overall overview on the 7 videos. So far we spoke about the 6 emotional videos, and we'll continue tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem. Wishing you all a wonderful day, and don't forget to subscribe, join, invite people. God willing, tomorrow will be live at 9:30, B'ezrat Hashem.